If you're a believer, this will harm you, mate. Only people who are going through the spiritual process should listen to this, mate. True. Listen, mate. We're all going to the ground on which everything arises. And from the ground, we can follow through everything that arises. And I'm not joking. I've got to explain this. My brain doesn't know anything, it observes everything. And everything it observes is increasingly fucking crazy, mate. Crazy intelligent, crazy perfect understandings of everything. Now, I'm in that ground quite a lot and understanding things. And therefore, I recognize the growth of that same understanding in other people. And they're not who you'd expect. There are some spiritual YouTube people who are seeing, but they're not the ones that are grifting off what they see. They're not the ones caught in helping others. They're ones who are more in solitude, in freedom, because that's what you need to see all this shit, right? But we don't need. Oh my God. I can't explain. I guess you could say it's a complete understanding of reality that's easily expressed in your own language. And any problem of humanity is solvable in that space. And it comes about necessarily through your instinctual freedom. Why do I say that? Your instincts are traumatized, hungry, dysfunctional. You can only understand them in their freedom. Because if you're imposing and constraining them, you're not understanding them. You're understanding your imposition. You ought to understand that you're imposing on them and understand that and clear it away so you can see. So be instinctually free and think how much energy you save, spiritual energy, emotional energy, mental energy, when you allow your instincts their free play. And that energy can be used to be careful and observe what's happening to understand it, right? Because you might do crazy shit. You might do things you regret, but that's the stumbling of the instincts back to freedom. And that liberates an enormous amount of spiritual energy, right? And that's why I think a lot of younger kids in America are waking up and growing this understanding naturally. Not just kids. There are some people who are older in America. Not all of them, but there's a lot more kids, I think, because they're seeing clearly. Their future's been taken. They don't want the life they've been offered, and they're looking to understand it from their own point of view rather than from the point of view of what society wants. And therefore, this is happening. And probably they don't have any beliefs, so they don't have any grounds except their own instinctual freedom. And that's the key thing. And that's the other thing. I'm sorry to say, but one of the most dangerous things for people who are waking up, oh no, it's up to you to figure it out. Look, it's up to everybody to figure it out because that's the process. Being free and seeing and understanding reality in freedom. It gives you so much more energy. But if you think you need to get a job, do a career, do this bullshit, then you're not going to get there. There's something much more valuable you can do right now. And that's see and understand what you are and what reality is in your freedom. You know, freedom's worth so much more than security because security without freedom is meaningless. I know that I want to know. Look, anybody can reach the ground. It is my ground. Look, there's a complete understanding of everything within the terrain of human knowledge, but also, no, understanding is different from knowing. I don't know everything that human knowledge knows, but the understanding puts all human knowledge in its right place and convicts the human knowledge which is erected on conceptual abstractions and falsehoods and theories. You know, science has been trying to explain everything physically, but that's like trying to explain human creation and like poetry by saying, well, there was a neurochemical synapse that, you know, the atoms went through and then it transmitted, you know, in that granular materialistic detail. That doesn't capture the phenomena we're trying to explain at all. It explains the mechanical architecture that we see on this level we call matter, right? But reality proceeds from a much deeper point, which is in our consciousness. And we can see our reality unfolding by being aware, deeply, penetratively aware of our own consciousness. And the outside world and the universe and the atoms and everything, they're very similar dynamics in all these levels. And when we understand ourselves, we begin to suddenly be able to understand everything, which doesn't mean we know everything. But if we encounter knowledge, so long as we understand the language and can see what they're describing, and so long as we can eliminate any conceptual abstractions which aren't facts, then we can put that knowledge in its right place. So it's not perfect, it's not total knowledge, but it's perfect knowledge, the perfect use of knowledge. Knowledge really is a social project. But this understanding can use the forms and concepts and ideas and language of society, but to the consciousness, it isn't concepts, it isn't theories, it's language. And it can use that language to communicate reality. And it can draw on data. You know, it might quote how many people have die every year because of malnutrition and starvation. That's drawing on data, but for expressive purposes, not for understanding. Understanding is and knowledge. No, the brain needs to be familiar with the terrain the knowledge is in. So if it doesn't understand cells or anything, then knowledge about cells hasn't got anywhere to stick for the brain, right? So it needs to understand the factual domain that's being talked about. And that's where knowledge can have a role. But that role is to help society, not for this consciousness. Look, I can't believe it, but I've got that consciousness here. It's true. And it comes from being free because the all becomes the particular. To be free in the particular. It's true, mate. Look, it's also the whole non-dual shit, like the Tao Te Ching and Ashtavakra Gita, which is probably my favorite spiritual text, I have to admit. They are talking about the reality that's here in you, that is you. But there's no practice in this consciousness. If you practice, that's the socially conditioned action. You can't practice meditation, it's bullshit. Look, this is basically, if you really listen to the Buddha and make sense of him, he acknowledged this, and so did Yiddu Krishnamurti, who was described by the Dalai Lama as like the greatest teacher in the 20th century, and he rejected all religion and all practices. Look, This is not something to believe, it's something to understand. When you practice, you're trying to get somewhere else, but the point is to understand what is now, obviously. So any attempt to get somewhere else is distorting now. Do you see that? That's a clear fact, indisputable. What the true teachers emphasize is you've got to understand yourself through your own perception, not through what others say. That's not understanding yourself. That's forming conclusions based on believing that person, right? Understanding is through perception, direct perception and understanding. And that isn't a practice. If you try and perceive and understand what you are, then that very action of trying to creates another dynamic which represses what's going on. So you've got to be free and see the importance of watching and understanding yourself in freedom, but not as because I said it. This is the thing that's hard to understand. Your brain has to discover the actual fact that you need to be aware of what's going on all of the time. Why is it a fact? Because it's your only fucking hope. And it's the only point in life. And the alternative, which is the socially conditioned intellect, depends on social order to function meaningfully. If the world collapsed, your intellect has very little value. Okay, right, look, I'm gonna have to end it there, but really, this is to those few people who are going through it. That's the thing. That's the thing. It ain't me. It's not me. Everyone is this. And if they can understand the need to be instinctually free and to watch yourself in that freedom, I don't see how it's avoidable that they too will just flower into this total consciousness. Funny world, innit?